So, we just have one planet to live on that we are passing on to future generations. This gives us a great responsibility to handle it well, even when we leave the world in good shape after we are gone. The actions of private companies and corporations have a far-reaching impact on the lives of people around the world, including their social and environmental rights. This is why we are now going to focus on corporate social responsibility, which is very important for businesses, but for all of us as well, examining the initiatives of businesses in tackling climate change. So I would like to, please feel free to join me on stage. Robert McCorquodale, a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, bringing deep insights into international law and human rights. Welcome on stage. Please feel free to take a seat. Then we have Claire Godding, a senior expert at Febelfin and co-chair of Women in Finance with a wealth of experience in diversity and inclusion. Welcome to you as well. And we have Julia Olofsson, Global Director of Human Rights at the INCA Group. IKEA is also part of it. She's responsible for setting strategic directions on human rights and social impacts. Welcome to you as well. And we have Gunther, Managing Director, SDG Innovation and Economic Transformation at the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. Welcome to this panel. So I would like to start with you, Mr. McCorquodale. What are the when do businesses bear responsibility for human rights and consequently can be held accountable on protecting them?
That's a great question. Oh, do I stop?
Yes.
That's a great question, if I could get the microphone. Because traditionally, only governments had responsibilities for human rights. They're the only ones accountable. That has changed enormously. Now today, there's international documents such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the OECD Responsible Business Conduct Guidelines, lots of guidance out there on the fact that businesses have responsibilities for human rights. Plus, it's now flown into a lot of EU legislation. A number of the legislation in France, in the Netherlands, in Norway refer to these international standards. Plus, whereas before you couldn't bring a case against a company for human rights abuse very easily, now there's a recent case in the Netherlands which was against Shell, an oil company, for its actions in Nigeria, which had huge amounts of pollution, for which Shell was both accountable and had to pay a whole lot of damages. So the position has transformed so that now business is generally accepted to have responsibilities for human rights and environmental damage and climate change consequences.
Thank you very much for this. Claire Godding, what would you say, what steps can businesses take to address the root causes of systematic inequality and also injustice within their own companies?
So what I would like to share actually is that companies can work, of course, on their own, but they can also work together. And what we have seen is like sector federations, they can act as lobbyists to defend, the status quo and to not be very active towards new challenges. Or they can, on the contrary, understand that challenging the companies is in fact giving them a service so that they will be more resilient towards the future. That is exactly what we have started to do 5 years ago. Providing tools to our members, challenging them, and making sure that they get some sector insights about the real issues and what they can do about it.
So then maybe we can cast a light on, let's say, INCA, but also IKEA is part of the INCA group. So, Julia Olofsson, what are the strategies the INCA group uses to mitigate the impacts of climate actions?
Thank you. So I think it's there are many strategies and many different ways in how we act, and I think there's two things that I want to highlight. I think one is the importance of having it really integrated into your strategies and steering documents, ensuring that you have that top-level ownership. You've set ambitious targets, for example, from climate. We set science-based targets to ensure that we are staying within and doing our part in contributing to keeping the temperatures below 1.5. Then I think it's really about, so one is the strategic integration, ensuring that it is fundamental to all of your business strategies and that you also take that perspective in to your governance and your decision making. Then I think the second part, and what we're talking about here, is really, I think, the game-changing nature that potentially human rights and environmental due diligence, once it becomes much more mainstreamed and mandatory, can have on companies when it comes, because that's really fundamentally about, you know, knowing your impacts and then taking action on them. And I think that will help us, and it will help many others, in really identifying where is it that we need to put our attention and resources to.
So, Gunther, what would you then say? What are the implications of the EU and individual member states like Germany on imposing legislations and regulations on the supply chain?
Yeah, thank you very much. I personally was a little bit involved in the German law some years ago in my former function. So, of course, I know a lot of this discussion, especially with German companies, international companies. And now I have to say I sit on the other side of the table and I have to deal with the impacts of this legislation on the producers at the beginning of the supply chain. And we, as UNIDO, this is for those who don't know this organization, United Nations Industrial Development Organization, we are just now in discussion with our partner countries, developing countries, how could they more or less deal with the impacts of this legislation. And if we discuss with our partner countries, I hear more or less two, three main topics. First of all is speak with us. Speak with us about that, what you plan to implement. And personally, I have to say my own experience in Germany, I think we didn't do it enough. Let me say it in that way. Secondly, come with unified requirements. You know, we have a discussion in Germany, we have a German law, we have discussion on European level, of course. Unfortunately, countries like Austria and Germany refused this EU Act. But we have different national, let me say, requirements, but we have also requirements from companies. I don't know if IKEA has some. There are, of course, also voluntary certifications. And this number of requirements is a big problem for a small, medium enterprise at the beginning of the supply chain. And what we also see is sometimes that these small, medium enterprises are kicked off of the supply chain because the big companies say they don't trust if they really implement these requirements. And this is also something what is, of course, let me say, like a boomerang for that what we wanted to do.
So what does UNIDO then do to support companies?
What do? We start first projects. First of all, we listen. We listen and we want to hear what is necessary from governmental side, but also from company side, of course. We start first project, but as a UN organization, we always depends on funds of donors. And I don't know if here's someone from the European Commission that there is, let me say, there are much more could be done. Because, if you want to improve your supply chain, at the beginning you need investment, for example, in wastewater management. You need perhaps also training, something like that. That costs all money. Yeah, and for that, of course, we could imagine that much more could be done.
So, Olofsson, could you maybe elaborate the Inca Group's stance on legislation, how it relates, for example, competitive positioning, because this is, I mean, to be very sustainable, also as a business group, is very important, isn't it?
Absolutely. So I think if we start with the legislation, because I think you touched on a few points there around how do we ensure that it is harmonized, that we don't go with, from a European perspective, you know, with 30 different countries coming with different requirements and different, because that is difficult for us to implement, and it's even more difficult for SMEs that are further down in the value chain. So I think I will, first of all, take that opportunity to urge the EU to actually adopt the ambitious CSDDD.
I agree.
Yeah. And then I think from our perspective, there's two things here to your question. One, I think, is really about the harmonization about legislation. We want legislation on human rights and environmental due diligence because it does help us. Yes, it will create a bit of administration and I think a big of shift, but I do also think it is something that we need. We've just completed a baseline assessment which has looked at how ready are we to meet that coming legislation. Where are the gaps in our system? Where do we have strength? Where do we have opportunities to improve? And I do fundamentally think that will help us make smarter business decisions going forward. Then if I look at what our customers actually say is that we do research every other year asking customers in all of our markets about what they think about climate and inequality. And the latest research came out now in October last year, and where we had our customers say that 77% of them say that they expect us to ensure human rights in our value chain. And, you know, one of the biggest individual actions that they say they can take is to boycott brands that do not. So there is that business incentive as well around, we want to make sure that our customers keep choosing us going forward as well, because this is something that matters.
Yeah. So, Mr. McCorquodale, what would you say? Is human rights due diligence distinct from traditional due diligence, which is like with a focus on individual than on business risk?
Yes, the traditional business due diligence is all about business risk. Let's say a company is taking over another company, they have to check what are the liabilities, what are the risks. And so they look at what are the risks to the business. The huge change of human rights due diligence is looking at the risk to people and the planet as your first risk, and then the consequence for business action. So that is a significant change. And what it also means is companies can sometimes cause or contribute to human rights impacts, but they can also be directly linked. So Julia was mentioning about down her supply chain, up her value chain. They can be directly linked to what's happening in their suppliers, and so there's a consequence to the company. So the company which is undertaking human rights due diligence needs to think about the consequences not just of their own actions, but also with those entities to which they are directly linked.
Yeah, so there's also now an increasing focus on supply chain transparency, Gunther Beger. How can businesses effectively collaborate with suppliers to ensure that they are respecting human rights?
Yes, I think first of all they have to know their supply chain. Yes. And it's, of course, it's not easy, I understand it, especially I learned, for example, to produce a shirt. Sometimes you have 140, 150 separate pieces. And, of course, you have to more or less control all these processes. But nevertheless, of course, there are technologies today, blockchain technologies, there are the other ways, of course. What I see at the moment, and once more from the perspective of the producer at the beginning of the supply chain, there is a lot of, let me say, unawareness of that, what is more or less required. I already mentioned there are a lot of different requirements, legislation, but also voluntary ones. And there is a real need for transparency, of course. First, you have to know what you have to improve. I think there has to be much more done. And when I'm from Germany, and I followed the discussions we have had and we have in Germany. There are very large programs from the German governments to support German, let me say, enterprises here in Europe, in Germany. And if I compare the funds that they spend for this, let me say, advisory of our German companies compared with that what is invested more or less at the beginning, yeah, I already mentioned there's a lot of, much more could be done. But of course, it's what is absolutely not, let me say, understandable if the responsibility is given to the next part of the supply chain. It is also something, discussion we have, of course. Yeah, that is something that I think won't work.
And another important aspect is like investor pressure, maybe, Claire Godding. So how do you see the investor pressure and shareholder activism influencing businesses to prioritize human rights and due diligence?
Well, first of all, what we see is also that more diverse boards typically even commit less fraud or have a stronger sense of ethic. We also see that diverse boards, especially in generations, in origins and in gender, tend to invest more resolutely towards sustainability. So what we've seen and done as a sector, I was hearing what you were saying also about the burden of training, for instance, or the burden to really understand the new legislations. When we have also a sector approach for this, you also all of a sudden create the peer pressure. And I must say I was amazed during the journey of these last five years to see how much peer pressure helps to go also towards good directions. So that's really interesting. We've seen, for instance, with the directive about, accessibility of products and services, which is important for financial industry also to make sure that, for instance, whatever your disability, you will be able to access banking services, banking products. So how do you do this? Well, we've worked on this not only from a sector perspective with the different institutions, but also involving disabled colleagues who could give their own insight about what was really accessible and what was just labeled accessible. And so these kind of elements really bring something extra, I think.
And ethics was also a very good keyword, because sometimes businesses are also engaging with, not always with democracies. So, Mr. McCorquodale, what ethical considerations should businesses take when engaging with, like, governments known for human rights abuses?
I think it can be quite difficult because there's a sense to which the business will have its own human rights policy or ethical policy, and then engaging with companies, engaging with the companies with governments who have difficult records, or perhaps it's a conflict area where there's maybe no easy and clear rules or regulation at all. I would say a couple of things. The first thing is that actually corporations can be very, very economically powerful. In many ways, often more powerful than the government. And so they can use their leverage to improve the process with the government, to improve the particular area, let's say access to clean water or whatever. So companies can be very strong in that leverage area, and particularly if they're prepared to work together. I mean, that's one of the lovely things about Claire's organisation. It works together as a group, and I think that can also be very effective. And if, let's say, it's a conflict zone, then the human rights due diligence should be heightened. They need to do more than they would normally do. So I think there are ways in which companies don't just say, we comply with whatever the law is. If that law puts in place, and I was going to use your same example of disability discrimination, that should not be a law which the companies should feel they just go to that low level. Yeah. But in fact, they should be complying with international human rights levels.
So what role do you see then for international standards, for example, like the UN guiding principles on business and human rights?
I think those international standards are very important because companies can begin to feel that they are operating at a particular level. And so looking at it from the other angle, if a company has a competitor, let us say, which is using child labour or which is using environmental destruction as the means to reduce the price, if that company is complying with the international standards and those international standards are accepted and regulated, that then lifts the whole standards and enables a competitive advantage rather than a disadvantage for a company complying with international standards on this area.
Yeah, Claire, Göring, you were nodding. So how can businesses also collaborate with NGOs and governmental agencies to ensure impactful approaches to corporate responsibility?
Well, indeed, that's something we see more and more regularly. I can give maybe the example of the label that we put in place in Belgium already 4 years ago. And of course, some of you may think, well, if it's a label put in place by the financial industry, just, greenwashing, that's it, end of the story. And yes, it's not perfect, clearly. But we made sure that the organization which is managing this label and the committees which are reviewing the possible products in order to determine if they fit as sustainable or not in our categories are fully independent. So it's a mix of academics, representatives of civil society and NGOs. And today what we see is we got in Belgium, but also abroad, around 600 billion euros who have been invested through 800 products which got the label. And having started relatively low, we just put new, stricter rules to make it even more serious. So I think it's also a question of a journey. What I've seen also on other dimensions is if we start too high, obviously we'll start with just the 2 or 3 corporates which are already ready to go. But that's not the point of working with a whole sector. You want a journey for everyone. So what we've done repetitively, also on digital inclusion, on financial inclusion, is we do start a journey with relatively reasonable standards where most companies will find, okay, I guess we could join. And once they join, we make sure we keep progressing, moving higher. So that's a little bit how it goes.
Yeah, so Febelfin has launched a sustainability label a few years ago. So what initiatives concretely has Febelfin undertaken to promote sustainability within the Belgian financial sector?
Okay, so next to that label, which was created, we've also worked a lot about digital inclusion on one side. Of course, it's absolutely crucial because within digital inclusion, you also find all the tools which will enable people to do financial operations online with an app and so on. So we've even like a hacker van, which is a kind of escape game inside a van where we go to schools in all kinds of less favored environments where kids and young adolescents can discover a little bit, oh, what's phishing? How can we avoid, to become financial mules, which is, of course, a very high risk also judicially. So that's for digital inclusion. Also, we launched a program to make sure we get more women in tech. For instance, we've developed a one-year program which allows to students of any kind of discipline or colleagues who work in any kind of job in like 6 months of courses during 2 or 3 days a week during the weekend and an internship to be ready to join digital and IT teams So these are examples. And then on financial inclusion, we've worked recently a lot also to make a link, which might surprise some of you, between finance and microfinance. Because it's two worlds which usually do not meet. And we've decided we'll sign in May a charter together with microfinance and several other partners in order to commit that our sector, when we face an entrepreneur who we cannot finance because of really lack of means, and in place of just saying no, we commit to check with him or her all the possible alternatives, including microfinance. So we start really to work together, which is rather new.
So, Mrs. Olofsson, how did the Inca Group then strategically think about integrating human rights due diligence in their operations?
In a couple of different ways. As I mentioned earlier, I think first and foremost, it's important that we have it integrated into our sustainability strategy, into our human rights and equality policy, so it sits across a number of different strategically important areas in the company. Then I think it's really about understanding how we operationalize it at this point. As I mentioned, we spent almost 8 months doing a baseline assessment together with external partners to really understand where are we today. And that included a number of interviews with people across the company, so not just people that are working within sustainability or within our people function or within our procurement function, but really looking across the totality of our operations and really understanding what are the things that they are seeing, what kind of processes do they have, how do they identify the impact that we have on people and the environment today. And so that gave us a lot of insights into what we're now then taking action on in terms of building a robust human rights and environmental due diligence system. So I think the overall priority is really around ensuring that we have that total system in place. Then, of course, there are certain things where we think you either want to go further or you want to ensure that this is something that we don't have where we think it's a priority. So one of the things that we're really working hard on now is our external grievance mechanism, so ensuring that we have a credible and trustworthy way for stakeholders who are affected by our business to engage with us. So that's one of the things. And the other one is really around, I think also it's been a bit of a change journey that's happened with the fact that the EU started with human rights and environmental due diligence, because I think for us and for many companies, we've had our climate work over here, and then we've had our human rights and social impact work over here. So what it has also led to is a much closer collaboration between our climate and nature team and our human rights and social impact team. So really sitting down and looking at how do we put a people lens to, for example, our climate transition plans, and ensuring, what the previous panel talked about, how do we make sure that nobody's left behind? So a concrete example is that currently we are looking at, together with experts who are guiding us on it, developing what does just transition principles mean for our company. So what is the sort of things that are guiding us when taking decisions where we know there will be both an environmental as well as a social impact, and how do we ensure that we mitigate any social inequalities that it might lead to, whilst also looking at how can we use the size and leverage that we do have to really also maximize the opportunities in both areas.
I wonder if I can just add one point on this. It's great to hear what Julia and Inca Group is doing, but many companies are nervous about doing that because, as I'm sure you found, they will find things they're not doing. Yeah. And do you publicize that? What do you do? And yet that is the nature of these things. There will be things you still have to do. There will be gaps which you need to fill. But my experience is companies are honest on that. Actually, sometimes it can help going forward. And in fact, there's actually a case example of this, a case in California against Nestle, where they said, we've done all these things, we've shown problems, but we are moving forward. And the court said, yes, you've taken reasonable action. And so I think sometimes the fear of this of companies is, it's too huge, we'll find all these problems and then we'll be sued. I don't think it's always the reality of it. It is risky, and it does take time and energy, as you know all too well. But in the long run, you're likely to have a more secure value chain and longer term engagement, and you're likely to have more consumers or customers who will want to engage with you because they will trust you.
Yeah, so considering then your experience, Gunther Beker, at UNIDO, what strategies can businesses adopt to integrate sustainable development goals into their human rights due diligence processes?
I think that our colleagues from the private sector can answer this question in a better way. I think there is no way not to do it. As you see, we have discussions, consumer more or less requirements. No one wants to eat chocolate, for example, where child labor is in it. And so I think there are a lot of let me say, possibilities, and there's also, what I understand, enough support. For example, here in Germany for companies, and I think there is no way not to do it, to look into the supply chain and to see where are the problems, what can you do to avoid these kind of damages for nature, but also in human rights. And yes, we as UNIDO, we are ready to support. And what I see is we have, let me say, more than a past joint forces. There's joint forces, you know. We have only 3, 4, 5 UN organizations who are working on this field, on this issue, and that is something what we started now. We work together with ILO, we work together with ITC, we work together with OECD for and joining forces and to let me say offer programs, support in a common way, and also to convince, for example, European Commission to do more on the ground. I think that is also necessary, and that's also something what I learned. I'm now for more or less 1 year in this position here, and my first contact with European Commission is to join forces, not come alone, and to see what we can do together. So, but nevertheless, of course, best answer will be from our friends from the private sector. And I think, okay, I think both your organization and your company, you belong to the front runners. That's of course. Sometimes, if I, for example, see and watch the discussion we had over the last 2-3 months on the European regulations, that brought me back 4-5 years ago when we had this discussion in Germany, and I think no German company more or less left the market after start of our German legislation.
And it was very interesting that you mentioned child labor. So, Mr. McCorquodale, what steps can businesses take effectively to address human rights risks in their supply chains or in their operations?
Child labour can be a very difficult one in some circumstances in some societies, but I have seen examples where companies have dealt with that. A particular company was involved in a farming industry, and they provided various farm equipment, and they were very aware that children were working on the farms, not going to school. Do they just pull out and refuse? And they were concerned then the next person who come in wouldn't care less at all. So what they did in that instance is they then worked out a loaning scheme of their equipment on the condition, on the condition that the children did not work on the farm between the school hours. And that transformed that whole group, that whole area, the range of different villages. The children then went to school, actually many of the children then learnt skills which led back to help the actual agricultural community, so that it was a very powerful way of recognising, whereas child labour should, as far as possible, completely stop. Sometimes it takes a process to get there.
And now I see, thank you very much for this, that we also have a question via Slido. This was also going to be one of my final questions. So how can we balance shareholders' profit expectations and human rights? Who would like to answer to that?
We don't have shareholders, so
Easy.
So,
Okay, I'm going to answer that, because the working group on business and human rights, of which I'm a member, has been recently doing a big project, you'll be interested in this, Claire, on investors and human rights due diligence and their links. And what we saw in some parts of the world, there's a big resistance to investors being involved in human rights, because they say it should all be about profit. But actually, what are we talking about when we look at profit? Is there a bigger societal engagement by companies beyond just profit making? Because the evidence shows that if a company is involved in a much more sense of what the UN Guiding Principles calls social license to operate, they have a societal expectation, they have a societal engagement, and they're not removed from that. And so therefore, in addition, if a company is, let's say, using child labour, actually it could well harm their profit, because the consumer may not want to buy from them. It could harm their profit because actually the consequences might be their rivals begin hammering their reputation. So the two aren't as far apart, I think, as it often can appear.
thank you
I
very
don't know
much.
whether that fits with your experience.
Any other remarks on that?
I would just say also that it's a kind of education process also again. I see, for instance, we may have some fears at first, like some nearly taboos on some of the topics, and then sharing, and what we have seen is especially sharing between CEOs is one of the keys, because we've put a few times like 20 CEOs in a room. It was more about like diversity and inclusion, big issues, but you could really see that when one CEO says to others, well, you know, we've investigated this, and I think we should be ready for this, and I think it's doable, then it has more effect than any consultant who says so, authorities which would say so. So we need to work on stakeholders, and definitely CEOs are a key stakeholder.
Thank you very much. So I guess this panel has shown that not only every single one of us, but also businesses have a huge responsibility regarding our future and the traces we leave in the world. Thank you very much, Robert McCorquodale, Claire Godding, Julia Olofsson, and Gunther Beger, for those insights. Thank you very much. Round of applause, please. And Friese, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Damla, and thank you, panelists. The next part of the program is another Connect, Reflect, Act talk. And before I'm going to introduce the next speaker, I just want to make the use of the opportunity to thank the sign language interpreters who are doing a brilliant job already from the beginning. And I noticed also the importance of their job also when they were interpreting also, for instance, Cesar Sampson's song, which got, in addition to the great performance, an entirely new dimension. So thank you so much for the sign language interpreters. Good, the next Connect, Reflect, Act talker is Michal Friedrich. Michal is a renowned Polish painter and a visual artist. Outside his main field of focus, he, in the past years, became known for his socially engaged art, which blends strategies taken out of contemporary art and the fields outside it with surprising results. His interventions touched, amongst others, the themes of environmental protection, the threats to democracy in Poland, refugee crisis on the Belarusian border, and the war in Ukraine. Having become an effective activist whilst not compromising the quality or originality of his artwork, may I ask your attention for Michael Friedrich.